Welcome to Lesson 3 of Section 3 of HOPE, where you are identifying and examining your trauma symptoms and their causes. Before a doctor prescribes a treatment or medicine, it is essential that they understand your symptoms and identify their underlying causes. The same is true for you as you seek to heal from emotional trauma. The reality is that trauma and significant experiences of loss or rejection and chronic stress, especially in childhood, are primary underlying causes of many emotional, mental health, and even physical health problems, and can manifest in many of the ways you identified for yourself in the slides in the previous lesson. So it is vital to understand and explore your areas of past and present trauma, significant loss, and stress in your life so you know which areas to focus on in the healing process. This will be a primary focus in the workshops to come. However, before we begin to explore more specifics and details of the kinds of events or circumstances that these can include, it is important to understand that not all trauma and stress is the same, and not everything is a trauma. So let's look more closely at what these mean and how we are affected by them. First, it is important to understand that the amount of stress or trauma we experience in a given situation, and therefore how much it will affect us, is dependent upon four things. The first is how severe or frequent we perceive the stressor or event to be. Although all traumatic events or stressors can impact us, the more severe an event, such as physical abuse, being in a severe car accident, the loss of a child, or the more frequent an event is, such as multiple losses in a short time, repeated exposure to a fearful event, or harm or circumstances, the more likely it is that there will be a greater impact on our emotional health and ability to cope. Please also note that it is our perception of the event that also matters. For a variety of reasons, some people will perceive some events to be more or less stressful than others, which also affect their response and coping. We cannot control our initial reaction or perception of events, but it does affect our response. People who are innately more sensitive will experience events in more powerful ways. The second set of factors affecting the level of emotional impact or trauma we may experience is how consistently or repeatedly we have experienced the stressor or similar stressors in the past. In addition to the severity and frequency of the events at the time, if we have a history of hurts, trauma, or stress beforehand, we may also be at a greater risk for emotional symptoms in response to events in the present. Even if my arm fully healed from a break in the past, it may now be more vulnerable to breaks in the future. People who have been impacted consistently or repeatedly by trauma, chronic stressors, or significant losses in the past frequently have less resiliency in responding to present stressors. The third set of factors affecting the level of emotional impact or trauma we may experience is whether or not we perceive there to be sufficient or helpful external resources and people available to help us deal with the stress. How we respond to trauma, significant loss, or stressful events or circumstances is often affected by our perceived ability of others who can support and help us. Again, I emphasize the word perceived because even if there are loving, supportive, or helpful people available and willing to help us, we have to perceive them to be willing and available if we are to find strength or comfort from them. This includes our view and relationship with God. Also, many times, people or resources are not available, especially in dysfunctional or abusive families, organizations, or communities, because the people around us are preoccupied with their own problems or lack of resources of their own. However, sometimes we don't perceive the help that is there or don't know how to ask for it. In either scenario, the more isolated and alone we believe ourselves to be, the more overwhelmed and powerless we will likely feel to be in the situation. Finally, a factor that affects the level of emotional impact or trauma we may experience from events is our own internal sense of security, stability, and resources. As previously mentioned, we can't give away what we don't have. No matter how much you may want to give me $500, if you don't have the money, you can't give it to me, even if you want to. When trauma, significant loss, or stressors come along, we can only respond from the resources we have available, and when our own security, stability, or resources are limited, especially when we are young, the events or situation will seem worse and likely be more overwhelming or impactful. That is why trauma or chronic stress and significant loss can be more significant for children, because they are by nature at a stage of development and dependency on adults, and are already lacking in some of these things, making them more vulnerable. As you begin to think about the traumas or significant losses and stressors you have had in your life in the lessons ahead, it is important to keep these in mind and what they mean for how you have been affected and your current struggle with painful emotions and trauma symptoms. But next, let's look at how trauma, significant losses, and stressors work for all of us on a neurological and survival level in our brain. You have probably already heard that when it comes to trauma, all of us are wired for fight, flight, or freeze in our bodily responses, memories, and emotions. All of these are protective responses and attempts to keep ourselves safe from harm, physically and/or emotionally. In and of themselves, they are actually good things that can help us to survive under different circumstances. In many ways, they can each serve a valuable function that can help us stay safer or survive depending on the situation. When we feel threatened, overwhelmed, or at risk of harm, our minds and bodies are simply reacting in ways to survive and cope, and we often respond automatically in one of these three ways based on our temperament, role, or perceived power in the situation, and each may have their benefits or drawbacks under the circumstances. Also, with all three of these reactions, our brains are responding to trauma by going into a state of high alert. We are sensing danger or threat, and our bodies and brains are being flooded with chemicals and reactions to prepare, and depending on the severity of length of the perceived threat, our brains and bodies may stay in this state longer, or may more easily return to it in anticipation of more danger. Again, these are God-given ways that He built into us for our survival. The important thing to remember is that these responses are automatic. We do not consciously choose them, but are usually simply reacting in order to cope with the threat to our emotional or physical safety that we are experiencing or that we perceive. Before considering more of how this works in the brain, let's first consider two major categories specific to trauma that have been identified in the research. Let's first start by talking about what trauma is. Although the word trauma has become a word that many people use more frequently in conversation, real trauma is an event or experience that threatens the life or physical integrity of a person or of someone critically important to that person, such as a spouse, a child, a parent, or a sibling. And the trauma produces intense physical and emotional reactions, including an overwhelming sense of terror, helplessness, and horror, and possibly physical sensations such as rapid heartbeat, trembling, dizziness, or loss of bladder or bowel control. Also, historically, research differentiates two different types of trauma and stress disorders. Type 1 is simple impact trauma or acute trauma. This type of trauma is more typically associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, such as that related to severe, single, time-limited events such as a serious accident, an act of community violence or crime, a natural disaster like an earthquake, wildfire, or flood, or the sudden loss or violent loss of a loved one, a physical or sexual assault, such as being shot, raped, or molested. And historically, it would include war events and other things like that that can impact people emotionally. Single impact or acute trauma often includes symptoms such as classic re-experiencing phenomena such as flashbacks, nightmares of the event, and extreme hypervigilance. Veterans who experience combat and suffer from PTSD are common examples of this kind of symptoms seen from acute trauma, although these types of symptoms can also show up in other types of trauma. Type 2 trauma, however, has been historically associated with a series of traumatic events or exposure to a prolonged traumatic stress or stressors, sometimes called chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is the experience of multiple traumatic events and may be recurrent trauma of the same kind, such as physical or sexual abuse, or varied traumas, such as witnessing domestic violence and then becoming a victim of community violence. In type 2 trauma, the effects of chronic trauma tend to build on each other, as each event serves as a reminder of previous trauma and reinforces its negative impact. Symptoms over time may also include denial, dissociation, and numbing, and are more likely to produce a larger array of emotional and behavioral symptoms rather than one coherent syndrome such as those listed for classic post-traumatic stress disorder, because of the ongoing and cumulative nature of the trauma and stressors that people are experiencing. A subcategory of chronic trauma is called complex trauma, sometimes also called developmental trauma. This kind of trauma describes exposure to chronic trauma and the impact of such chronic exposure on a child and later adult. That's why it's called developmental, because it's happening as the child is growing. Complex trauma describes a person who has endured multiple interpersonal traumatic events from a very young age, and the trauma was usually caused by adults who should have been caring for and protecting the child. Overall, symptoms of classic post-traumatic stress disorder that may be seen as a result of all kinds of trauma include things like depression, isolation, rage, alienation, survival guilt, anxiety reactions, fixation on the trauma or recurring or intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, obsessions, disturbed sleep, dissociation or disconnecting from reality or people, emotional numbing, blocking, or repression of memories. As you can see, these are some of the symptoms that we also identified in the previous list of symptoms in the lesson before. Beyond these historic professional understandings of trauma and stress disorders, however, it is also now recognized that trauma, significant losses, and chronic stress and severe rejection, especially when experienced before adulthood, can cause similar symptoms or result in ongoing depression, anxiety, anger, difficulty regulating emotions, and mood and other struggles in life. Re-experiencing trauma symptoms can also include symptoms like intrusive images, sounds, thoughts, or other sensations associated with traumatic events. Memories that come back in fragments, symptoms that happen when awake and when asleep in the form of nightmares, and other such symptoms. Trauma reminders or triggers can also include things like things, events, situations, places, people, smells, tastes, or even feelings that trigger other emotional reactions and unexpected feelings for trauma survivors. Reacting to relationship dynamics and stressors similar to the past can also be a trigger. The brain reacting in a way that makes you feel like a child again or vulnerable, as if your younger self is back inside the trauma, is a common experience for those struggling from chronic trauma symptoms. Finally, other symptoms of trauma stress reactions may also include having a heightened startle reflex, including overreacting to seemingly minor noises, disturbances, or information, sleep problems, difficulty concentrating, including being easily distracted and having trouble paying attention. Sometimes trauma can be mistaken for ADHD, when in reality it's rooted in traumatic experiences of the past that have affected someone's brain. Symptoms can also include avoidance of thoughts, feelings, places, and people associated with the trauma or past losses or significant stressors. Emotional numbing, being unable to feel anything or not reacting normally to daily events. We will further explore trauma and chronic stress as it relates specifically to childhood and families in an upcoming lesson. But to build upon our understanding of our physical and emotional survival system, we should understand that we are built to learn by experience and have a built-in internal survival alarm system that leads to our trauma reactions. And this is how it works. However, for now, let's review a brief explanation of how trauma, chronic stress, and severe loss affect the brain and why. First, a perceived threat occurs. When this happens, and depending on how threatened we believe ourselves to be, the brain releases chemicals that raise our heart rate and blood pressure and increase attention and focus. Again, this is for the purpose of responding to a threat and survival. The brain releases chemicals that help the body to respond to the threat, including our fight, flight, or freeze response. If the threat is removed, everything returns to normal. This may take some time and assumes that we believe that the threat is over. If you think about this picture in terms of a snake that you might encounter in the wilderness, you might have an initial reaction of fear when the snake appears, but if you recognize that the snake is a garter snake and it moves along, your trauma response and your fight, flight, or fear reaction will quickly dissipate, and you'll go back to normal. So if the threat is removed, everything returns to normal. However, if the threat continues or is constantly repeated, the system tends to stay on red alert. Later, the brain can react to reminders or similar stresses as if you are back inside the trauma. In essence, even smaller future threats can pull our brains and bodies back into believing they are threatened with the previous severe trauma. The brain can be wired or stay stuck in a state of chronic high alert or be easily triggered to return there even when the threat is not the same. As you can see, as a result of trauma, our brains and emotions can be impacted in such a way as to keep us stuck or continue to produce emotional and behavioral symptoms long after the threat is over. The great intensity, frequency, or chronic nature of the stress or trauma increases the tendency of your brain to stay in a state of high alert, resulting in many of the symptoms described in the last lesson. So, as we wrap up this lesson, it is important to understand that because trauma, serious loss, or significant and ongoing stress keeps us internally stuck in a state of focusing on survival and coping and high alert, we often don't understand the underlying causes or triggers of our painful or negative emotions in the present. Instead, we often focus on things like managing our symptoms by trying to medicate them or keep them at bay with new people, things, distractions, substances, work, or experiences, as we have described in the past, instead of seeking healing or realizing that our system needs something as a response to trauma, which requires facing the hurts, working through the pain and vulnerability in relationships. Or we might focus on blaming others or outside current events and circumstances and thinking and saying things like, if only blank would change, or if only it weren't for blank, then I would feel better, or everything would be okay. Although our symptoms and things in our current circumstances may indeed be real, we often do not realize, see, or understand the healing that is needed below the surface and its connection to our trauma so that our emotions can begin to change. In the next section of Hope, we will explore more deeply the connection between our emotional fruit and roots and the specific impact that families and childhood experiences may have on our current emotional symptoms. As we close this lesson, remember that recovery means we have to own or take responsibility for all of our symptoms, their sources, and our own growth in order to heal. Even though trauma is something that happened to us and not something we chose, it becomes our responsibility to take care of ourselves and seek healing and change for the ways that it has affected us. Sometimes this can feel overwhelming or frightening or make us angry knowing that we did not choose the pain in the first place. But we can trust God with this process as we face the truth and His love and grace and ability to use all things for good in our lives. Once again, let me pause to pray for you as you continue your healing journey and consider these things. Father, thank you that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that you actually designed us with our response to fear in order to actually help us. But in this fallen world, God, sometimes it affects us in ways that actually lead to more problems. Lord, as we consider the ways that we've been hurt by trauma, especially in the past, if it's been complex and developmental from our childhoods, Lord, I pray that you would be with each person, helping them to not only see the truth of what happened to them, that they might face it, but also that they would see that through this process, you long to heal them and be their Father and provide the grace and truth they need to be set free. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen. In this section, you have learned about the importance of remembering God's grace, a biblical view of infirmities, the impact of sin, and the kind of symptoms you may be experiencing based on your past trauma. You also learned about trauma and its definition, and kinds and how it works in our brains and bodies. In the next section, we will examine more closely the kinds of wounds we can experience, especially in families, and how they can affect us in different ways, so we can begin to understand how to help heal them. However, before moving on to the next section, you will finish section 3 by completing your reflection and activities for healing in lesson 4. The next lesson will briefly describe those activities. We'll see you there.